Oh, hey, sorry. I didn't realize we were doing this now. Yes, okay. No worries, I'm ready. We got it. Okay. This and the previous lecture are the only two lectures that discuss physiology directly. That being said, try and keep these ideas in the back of your mind as we go through the other lectures. And that's because basic physiology in many ways will determine how organisms can function and evolve. We'll talk about how simple aspects like lignin were fundamental to the growth and evolution of plants. When comparing to animals, things are slightly different. There isn't one main thing that can be identified as being the most important thing. Rather than trying to highlight specific examples, I'll instead explore some kind of fundamental aspects that set the rules of how ecology affects how animals evolve. The first is size, and the various aspects that are involved with species maintaining a specific size. I kind of made this text big on purpose because it's about size. The first rule that we'll look at is Cope's rule. This rule focuses on how the size of organisms changes over time. When the first animals evolved, they were generally, small. And over evolutionary time, animals have gotten bigger. So early primates or horses or cetaceans were all smaller, and more recently versions of them are larger. And you can see that as average body mass changing over millions of years. And as you can see with the purple line here, carnivores evolved to be larger at a faster rate, which we'll get back to later. Whoa, does that mean that everything is increasing in size and soon will be overrun by giant animals? Relax. Not really, because if we look at the general distribution of animals that live in these different continents, most of them are still very small. And the minimum size of animals hasn't changed over evolutionary time, it's just that the maximum size has, and things get larger as they evolve. And that's because at some point you need to be a certain size to have a certain functionality. If you think about it, there's a minimum size a mammal has to be able to contain all the necessary parts that make it a mammal. Think about the space that's necessary for things like lungs and the circulatory system. You can only get those things so small before they can't exist. So this increase in size is thus a result of new phylogenetic groups evolving to be larger as new anatomical and physiological innovations evolve. And these new innovations can then lead to, further opportunities for the evolution of new innovations that further require a larger minimum size. So overall size is important because it determines how the organism interacts with the environment and the rules that it must follow. And this leads into the second aspect of size that's summarized by Bergmann's rule. This deals with temperature regulation. If we take a look at this mouse right here, it's pretty small. Let's just represent this mouse by a cube for now because, volume and area are just much easier to calculate on a cube than they are on a mouse. If we have this cube that is 2 units in size, and we can calculate the surface area of the cube as 2 units times 2 units times 6. 6 because there are 6 sides to a cube, and this equals 24 units. And if we calculate the volume of the cube, it's 2 units times 2 units times 2 units, which equals 8 units. So you can see that the cube, which represents the mouse, has a bigger surface area than it has volume. Now, let's imagine a bear, and we'll represent this bear by a larger cube. And yes, I know it's not to scale, but there's only so much space on this slide. Anyway, if we run through the same calculations, this time the surface area is 4 units times 4 units times 6 sides, which equals 96 units. And the volume is 4 times 4 times 4, which is 64. Why does this matter, Michael? Well, students, it matters because although the surface area is 4 times larger, the volume is 8 times larger for the bear. And that's a huge change in ratio of surface area to volume. And that's important because animals lose a lot of heat from their surface area and keep heat due to their volume. And as you gain size, your volume grows faster than your surface area. And having more heat capacity or volume will compensate for the increased loss of heat through your skin or surface area. And you can imagine that this would be hugely beneficial in cold climates. Now, of course, this changes slightly for ectotherms compared to endotherms, because ectotherms regulate their temperature through external means. But it still means that ectotherms will lose heat more slowly if they are bigger. So hopefully now you can see that the ecological environment of the organism will shape the evolutionary trajectory of that organism because of basic chemistry and physics. And this now leads nicely into the metabolic theories that also explain the size of organisms. More generally, metabolic theory predicts the rate at which resources are taken up from the environment and how they are spent on different life history traits, such as growth or reproduction, and how this in turn affects different ecological aspects and relationships between organisms within a system. And as you can imagine, this is a really broad theory that considers a lot of different variables. But we're not going to go that far, and we're going to focus on one thing, metabolic rate, because it's also involved with size. Metabolic rate is the rate that organisms take up, transform, and expend energy, and this again is determined by first principles of physics, chemistry, and biology. Animals convert their food into energy for three major functions: biosynthesis, which includes aspects such as growth and development; maintenance, which deals with aspects such as body repair and regulation; and generation of external work, which are things like individual performance and behaviors. All of these aspects can occur because of metabolism. And interestingly, there's a pretty strong rule that predicts how animals use energy, and this is shown here. If we take a look at an organism's metabolic rate, it is essentially determined by its size. And if you think about it, it makes sense, doesn't it? Because the bigger you are, the more energy you need to burn to do the different things that you do. Now, of course, this is just the average for a species, and different individuals on a species may vary from that one-to-one line, but they are pretty close, varying slightly off that line as a consequence of a number of different factors, which we'll talk about in part 2. But the point is that metabolic rate and size are very tightly linked with one another. What is really interesting, though, is what happens when we look at the metabolic rate per kilogram of body mass to overall size. And what we see here is a very different relationship. Smaller organisms have a much higher metabolic rate and oxygen consumption per kilogram of body mass. And as animals get larger, they consume less oxygen. That means that smaller animals like shrews and mice need a lot more energy to function. That's also why researchers that work on small mammals need to check their traps very often, because if they don't, the stress and lack of food will end up resulting in them dying really quickly. But back to the point of metabolic rate and energy use. The fact that species that vary in their size also vary in their energy use, which feeds back into how the organism interacts with the environment. If we look at the relationship between size of an animal and the amount of space it uses, we see that larger animals have larger home ranges. And this makes sense because they need more space and because they have higher absolute energy needs. So they need to consume more resources. And smaller organisms require less food but have higher energetic costs associated with movement because of their higher metabolic rate per kilogram of body mass. So they have smaller home range sizes. What's even more interesting is that if you classify individuals into what they eat, you find that carnivores, animals further up the trophic level, have larger body sizes and larger home ranges than herbivores or omnivores. So that earlier question about why carnivores evolved to be larger at a faster rate, well, it's likely due to their energy requirements and the size of their home ranges. So you can now start to see how the fundamental aspects about underlying physiology of animals can start creating rules about how animals function within an ecological system and how they interact with other animals. Like everything, it's all connected.